Hi everyone, it's Sonia here. So I wanted to do a follow-up to my other two China videos that were concerning the Chinese extreme lockdowns for the purpose of their zero COVID policy. So how did this all turn out? Did they get out? And how did they get out? Well, the good news is that Shanghai is now finally ending the lockdowns. But the road to this was one that was paved with a lot of civil unrest. So I'm going to explain to you what happened. Before I start, I just want to say thank you for liking the video. Thanks for subscribing. Thank you for your support on Patreon. That keeps my channel going. I just want to add a footnote that when I do these kinds of videos, pretty much I can't monetize them. So I really do appreciate your support because that helps me make these kind of videos. So also, some of you guys may know the purifier pouch, which is ClO2 pellets that are activated by the moisture in the air to release a bit of ClO2 gas, which eliminates viruses, bacteria, fungus, and mold, and thereby removes odors. These are awesome, especially in your car, or if you want to deodorize something very hard to clean. Moldy stuff, moldy curtains, smelly shoes, you name it. Put it in a bag with one of these, leave it overnight, and by morning, I promise you the smell will be gone. And also I have the water purification tabs, ClO2. One of these will purify 10 gallons of water. So if you're interested, please check out the link below for more info and a discount. So let's talk about China. Zero COVID policy. Can it even be achieved? We don't know, but they're certainly trying. Disclaimer, this video may be somewhat critical of the CCP and the Chinese zero COVID policy and their extreme lockdown. However, this is not to be taken as advice that you should defy any government orders where you live. Yes, I'm certainly not encouraging you to do anything illegal. Let's just make sure that that's nice and clear. The people of Shanghai have been subjected to the harshest lockdown in the world, ordered to stay in their dwellings, blockaded in their buildings. In addition to not being able to get access to food, they also couldn't get access to medical care or prescription drugs. As the lockdown dragged on, so did their suffering, including psychological suffering. The kids were sent to school in hazmat suits, something that I think only happened in China. I can't imagine what this would do to the poor child psychologically. I don't know how the kids would ever recover from this. Another thing that was traumatic was the constant COVID testing. I mean, yes, if you have an epidemic and you're trying to figure out who's got the disease, you kind of have to test people. But the Chinese had so many tests that it became really difficult for them psychologically. And, after a while, they weren't exactly going along cooperatively with this, but the men in the hazmat suits would just sort of come and find you where you are, get that swab up in your nose, and get what they needed. Psychologically also, knowing that when you get tested or your parents get tested, they're going to be taken away, or maybe you're going to be taken away. The little kids were scared that if there's a positive test, or even just if there was a test, that this means I'm never going to see my mom again. So what happened was, at a certain point, they reached their limit. I mean, people were in quarantine up to, over 80 days with no end in sight. So at a certain point, they crossed the line into thinking, well, this is never going to end. And they became a lot less willing to go along with it. And the Chinese government doubled down. There was some footage here of a man who apparently maybe wasn't super cooperative. They wrapped him up in packing tape like a sausage before they took him away in an ambulance. So the more this went on, the less people were willing or able to behave in a civil fashion and just go along with things. There were food riots, more and more of them. I mean, with the extreme shortages of food, when some food did appear, it was basically an absolute free-for-all. A bit of a chaotic scene here with people trying to grab some melons for themselves. So eventually what happened was people, driven by an instinct for self-preservation, started to just outright defy the lockdowns, defy government orders. such as these people who got hold of a ladder and used it to climb out the window and down the side of the high-rise apartment that they were living in. So what came after that was more and more civil unrest, less and less willingness to comply with orders to stay in the house. You have more people, and eventually the people began to overwhelm the stormtroopers, to bust down doors and to just pour into the streets, even chasing the stormtroopers away, sometimes even attacking them. I mean, as you see here, you have one or two stormtroopers for, several dozens or maybe even hundreds of people. In this case, they had come to arrest a couple of teenagers, which didn't go well for the stormtroopers at all, and they ended up being chased down the street by a number of residents. On an individual level, also, people just sort of got to the point where they said they've had enough. They started to lash out against government health workers, workers enforcing these rules, including, of course, the stormtroopers. And they just said, the buck stops here. We're not going to allow this to happen anymore. Eventually, they just kind of said no and became really uncooperative. Here was a scene at night where what looks like hundreds of people who were supposed to be in lockdown decided that they weren't in lockdown anymore and just sort of poured out into the streets, jumping over turnstiles, disregarding the stormtroopers, fighting off any healthcare workers or fighting off any government workers who were trying to intercept them. It's like the government could take it to a certain point, could go so far, and at some point it just became a case of massive civil unrest. It got so extreme that there was actually quite a lot of violence against the stormtroopers. What you see here is a shot from an apartment building window of a blanket on the ground. But what is under the blanket is actually a stormtrooper who had been thrown from a balcony on the building. So it got to that point where people were just absolutely not cooperating anymore. It had erupted into violence. And even some people had lost their lives. So I guess the government got to a point where they had to ask themselves, are we going to double down now, send in reinforcements, and I don't know, do whatever it takes to keep these people locked in their houses? Or should we start to ease off? It had become such a matter of life and death for the people who were inside these lockdowns that they were no longer compliant, and they were just trying to preserve their own lives. So was the government willing to go further? Well, apparently not. Shanghai lockdown, residents demand release and some get it. Well, as you know, the way they demanded it was not by, maybe waving some posters out the window or yelling or having a protest or writing to their representatives or calling the hotline. They took to the streets to decry lockdown restrictions. By the following morning, they were free to leave. By the end of the week, other groups of residents had confronted management in their complexes, and some had won at least a partial release. Beijing, Shanghai eased COVID restrictions as outbreaks fade. So that was the other aspect of this, was that, in fact, if you look at the graphs, the COVID cases had gone way down. Now, they weren't at zero, so I guess the government could have said, well, they're not all gone yet, so we need to keep this going a bit longer. But I guess between the decrease in cases and the extreme resistance from the public, the government got to a point where they decided that maybe it was time to ease up. Shoppers returned to the malls of Beijing. The pandemic restrictions were relaxed, outbreak effectively under control. Interesting how the media frames it that it's because the outbreak's under control, not because civil unrest was exploding. Partial reopening of stores and offices. The zero COVID policy had increasingly frustrated residents. Yeah, that's putting it mildly. Some have resisted and staged protests, you could say. Restaurants, however, remain closed. So here's the curve. I mean, it's quite low. Most countries would consider this a satisfactory outcome as far as COVID is concerned, but, China, they want zero. So China had been doing this under the critical eye of the rest of the world. Even the Fauci himself didn't look fondly on their extreme strategies. U.S. health advisor says lockdowns don't work in isolation. Lockdowns must be used to prepare the population to prevent the future spread of infection, Fauci said. Doing a lockdown and nothing else is a strategy that doesn't work, he said. Now, there was a clip of Fauci out there where he admitted that the purpose of the lockdowns was, you lock people down and you get them vaccinated before you let them back out. If you just lock them down and then you let them out, then the epidemic or pandemic's just going to pick up where it left off. So he had pretty much said the purpose of the lockdowns was to use it as a time for when you can get people vaccinated. So the problem with China was that even though vaccine uptake was high, they had had 2 shots, homegrown shots of inactivated Sinovac, which turned out to be less effective, according to this, than the mRNA and the other shots that the Western world had been using. And so many people hadn't gotten 3 doses they needed for full protection. So if the goal of lockdowns was to get people vaccinated, was that what happened in Shanghai? It's kind of hard to tell. And if you look at their data here from Our World in Data, so it's 88.9% fully vaccinated. How much did it go up in the last, 3 months or so? Not that much. So it seems like a lot of people had already had the 3rd dose before, but I guess not enough, according to the Chinese government. So was a vaccination campaign a part of their strategy during lockdowns? I'm not really sure. It looks like maybe a little bit. But in any case, these extreme lockdowns are now easing up. But as Sky News says, it's not over. So here is a clip of the Chinese people rushing out to go and get food when they were finally let out of lockdown. You can just imagine after so many days. And another thing that happened was a lot of them tried to get out of there completely, as in they all went to the airport, went to the train station, tried to take a bus to get out. Some of them even just grabbed their luggage and decided to just walk, since actually hard to get transportation. Once they'd been through this grueling ordeal in Shanghai, a lot of them just decided, like, there is no solution here. We need to get out before we end up in a quarantine in our apartment again, or end up in a quarantine center. As you see on this footage from Sky News, the lines were just huge. In Shanghai, they still have a lot of these controls in place, and foreigners who are living there, some of them did speak out to the Western media and say, well, it was like 88 days of lockdown. Our kids are traumatized, and they feel like, they don't know if this could just come back at any moment. So they're kind of living in this state of ongoing trauma and stress of not knowing if they're going to end up locked up again. The Chinese media was heavily censored through this. So here was a clip and where the woman started to say, how bad it was. And I've never seen anything like this. It was unacceptable. They just take the mic away from her. They wanted to reinforce a certain kind of narrative, even though the rest of the world looked at this and said, like, what the hell is going on here? And still China was trying to encourage the idea that it was okay and it was necessary. I feel really bad for the people of China. I know that a lot of them perished from lack of access to food and medicines and medical treatment, and it's just, like I said in my other videos, this was really a humanitarian crisis, and we could just sort of see it unfold. So a lot of stuff was leaking out. Our media was sort of reporting on it, and just sort of sit here helpless. The good news is that it seems like it's over, but it's also possible that this could come back. I was very interested to follow this to see how this would turn out. It's also kind of a cautionary tale to the rest of the world. I have to be careful what I say here. I don't want you to think that I'm telling you not to respect your health guidelines, COVID guidelines. But how far can these things go before it crosses the line where they're really just doing more harm than good? I don't personally think that what China was doing was a good thing. I think a lot of the world feels that way. So that's it. I hope that you appreciated this information and found it useful. Please let me know what you think in the comments. And let's hope that that's it for China. and that they find a better solution to their COVID problems. So thank you again for liking the video. Thank you for your support on Patreon. And thanks for checking out the link for the pouches that remove all odors. I promise they really, really do work. It's like one of my favorite things that I've ever found. Super awesome, very useful. And thanks for listening to me, and I'll see you next time.